The barkeep asked why we carried weapons inside. We said mimics. They laughed. We laughed. The table laughed. We killed the table. Good times. Hi everyone, it's your local Game Master Jimmy here. Welcome to the lore video of mimics. Maybe you clicked on this video because you wish to uncover more knowledge of the whimsical shapeshifters known as mimics. Maybe you clicked because you saw a little treasure chest and thought, yep. In any case, I want to guarantee there will be at least one detail you haven't heard of yet, as we explore the lore of mimics in Dungeons & Dragons. Those of you familiar with the game, I primarily draw my sources from the Forgotten Realms, which builds a more concise form of information, but I will dip into other source material for the sake of clarity and elaboration. With that, let us dive into the first appearance and description of the mimic, which comes from the first edition monster manual. Mimics are subterranean creatures which cannot stand the light of the sun. They are able to perfectly mimic stone or wood. There are two varieties of this creature, the large, semi-intelligent, carnivorous killer mimic, and the slightly smaller, intelligent sort. While the former will attack anything which is nearby, the latter are generally friendly if offered food. All mimics move about constantly in their search of prey. Mimics pose as stonework, doors, chests, or any other substance or item they can imitate. When a creature touches the mimic, the latter lashes out with a pseudopod, delivering 3 to 12 points of damage per hit. Meanwhile, the mimic excretes a glue which holds fast whatever member the creature touched the mimic with. The killer mimics do not speak, but the other breeds have their own language and can usually speak several other tongues such as Common, Orcish, etc. For consideration, they'll usually tell a party what they've seen nearby. I always found this description to paint a rather clear picture of the mimic, which is usually a little uncommon for earlier D&D books. But the first edition monster manual is definitely where a lot of the descriptions first kicked up their game. To speak quickly on the origins of the creature as a whole, Gygax is attributed as the creator of the creature, and it was designed to encourage players to be more careful in dungeons. So with that in mind, let's dive into a full description of them using all our source material, and then go over the rest of their lore throughout D&D. Mimics were first and foremost semi-intelligent, carnivorous shape-changing predators that assumed the shape of mundane furnishings in hopes to attract prey to interact with them. In some means, they have been described as aberrations, monstrosities, and shape-changers. And while mimics varied in size to some degree, they were around 15 cubic feet and could assume whatever shape they needed to provided they retained their volume overall. The mimic naturally had a rough speckled gray skin that would be reminiscent of unpolished granite, but when it shape-changed, it could control the pigmentation of its skin, creating different hues and textures that could resemble wood, stone, or even metals. Their overall weight could be up to 4,500 pounds, which they would use in conjunction with naturally secreted adhesive to restrain creatures that came in contact with them for its consumption. The forms they often took would be objects like chests, doors, false walls, or any oddity of furnishings. Think any object you might want to interact with commonly. Now that we have a general understanding of what mimics are, let's dive into what we know of the ecology of their place in the realms. A lot of what we know of the mimic ecology has been explored in the AD&D Monstrous Manual and Dragon Magazine 75's The Ecology of the Mimic by Ed Greenwood. Greenwood formulates the ecology as notes from a scholar named Merloon. Merloon distinguishes the existence of multiple types of mimics that exist, and that they were grouped into two categories: a larger, less intelligent kind that kills for survival, it does not speak, and is not picky on its prey. The latter type is the intelligent mimic, which is described as eloquent and capable of reason and bargaining. These mimics have a unique, undecipherable language, and will often know the languages of orcs, dwarves, and the common tongue given the creatures they live near. As we know, mimics are naturally a rough gray tone. Their exterior skin is smooth and very hard, and they adjust this color by manipulating and shifting pigmented liquid from interior and exterior body cells. This allows the creature to resemble wood, stone, and other textures. Similarly, the pigmented liquid is often released if the mimic is struck, although rather than blood red, it is a brownish color. This mimic stores this liquid in large sacs and pumps that function as muscular organs in the mimic. They can squeeze these muscle organs' cavity walls to expel the liquid toward their outer skin layer, which can fill up their capillaries. If they wish to reverse the transformation of this pigmentation, since they are shapeshifters, they can contort their body and wriggle around, releasing the liquid from the capillaries and filling the organs once again. To simplify that explanation for a real-world explanation that might help, when you work out, get nervous, or do something to cause your heart to start beating faster or raise your body temperature, this increases blood flow in your body. When blood flow increases in your body, blood vessels dilate. The dilation allows more blood to reach the surface of your skin, and this is why your face blushes when you work out or get nervous about something. Essentially, this process is what the Mimic can control on its own. They can control the dilation of this brown liquid and cause the exterior to change hues. Another unique feature the Mimic has to do biologically is it constantly replaces these layers of skin just below the exterior hard layer. Much of the movement and stress it puts on its body requires it to constantly be manipulating these close to the surface skin layers, and for that, its body naturally replaces them often. The Mimic moves itself the same way it combats creatures using a feature called pseudopod. A pseudopod in real life is a term in microbiology used to describe arm-like projections of certain cell membranes with an intent of moving. Though, in Dungeons & Dragons, when a Mimic pseudopods, it's likely going to be punching you with its meaty arms. Jokes aside, the pseudopod implies a temporary ligament being used to control movement or combative actions, including biting. What really particularly made Mimics deadly was their ability to naturally create a strong adhesive that was extremely hard to detach from. What made this naturally produced adhesive interesting and particularly valuable was the Mimic had control on how strong the adhesive was. It would use this adhesive to climb walls, dangle from ceilings, and not let your thief go. The only real known countermeasure to the adhesive is alcohol, which was known to lighten the integrity of the adhesive temporarily. And I know for some reason some of you might be wondering, Jimmy, is that the only liquid Mimics produce? No, it isn't. Mimics also have the capability to excrete a wretched liquid that smells like rotten meat. This liquid is used to attract smaller treats like rats or hold them over between eating adventurers. This might also be an important time to note that Mimics' bodily fluids were largely known to be almost acidic to the touch. This is often represented in damage types in later editions. This benefit also allowed them to entirely be immune to acid damage as well as immune to the effects of most oozes. The last thing I want to cover regarding the ecology of the Mimic is its eyes. Mimics don't have traditional eyes like most creatures. Along their whole body, they have sensitive regions of their body that are patchy points of eye spots that are collections of their liquid pigment that are sensitive to light, heat, and vibrations. While it's unclear exactly how they utilize these sensitive eye spots to see, it is known that it is rather sensitive to bright light and heat, so the Mimic would largely dwell in darker areas. So now that we have an understanding of how these shape changers function, let's uncover how they were made and how they reproduce. Mimics are believed to have been created by wizards a long time ago in the past to protect their treasure and tomes from thieves. A somewhat honorable intention to try and protect their own treasures, but it was the equivalent of opening Pandora's box, and rather than evils coming out, the box just eats you. It is somewhat controversial if Mimics came about from wizards or if they came from the otherworldly. D&D has actually changed their creature types several times throughout the editions, 3rd and 4th edition both referring to them as aberrations, which have historically implied otherworldly or of the far realm. That said, despite the creature's typing, 3rd edition does clarify the Mimic was likely created by forgotten wizards. So maybe we can have a general idea of where Mimics might have been created, and using the idea of long forgotten wizards, we might be able to look at the Forgotten Realms creator races, the Batraki or the Saruk. While none of this is written out in any lore book, we can assert that the Batraki or Saruk fit the description as to being magic users that had valuable items they needed to protect, and both had means to creating shapeshifter creatures, which they both did. 4th edition is the strong contender for remarking on Mimics coming from the Far Realm, not providing much information other than commenting their origin to come from the Far Realms, but exists to establish some controversy in the speculation of their origin. Similar to the 4th edition version of the Lamia, I won't cover extensively the logic as to the choice in stating they are from the Far Realm because there isn't a lot of information about it. And to include other contenders of Mimic origins, we have a couple different references from other notable settings. O-Earth lore claims that Mimics existed since the dawn of time, and that fact alone is contested by the Lich Thessalar, who claims to have made them. This is definitely controversial, as Thessalar claims to have made several monstrosities of O-Earth, so the fact is highly speculated. Eberron attributes the creation of the Mimics to Delkir Kryzen, one of Zoriat, the Realm of Madness. Oddly, I find this one a little speculative too, because what I know best of Kryzen is that he likely made Gibbering Mouthers, but there's the chance I guess he could have made both. But let's move on. When we talk about reproduction habits of a mimic, we get to the interesting question of how can they if they were magically created by wizards. And this is where the point of the video comes into. I bring up my sponsor, Jeff Goldblum, to say, life finds a way. We don't know if the wizard creators intended for these creatures to reproduce, but they certainly learned how. Similar to several bacteria or amoeba, the mimic reproduces asexually through a process called fission. Fission involves the division of one part into two or more multiple parts and resemble the original. Mimics would perform the fission process after they grow too much from eating. The process involved them splitting into two smaller mimics that would grow to maturity over the course of a couple years. The process had been observed and understood in many places in Dungeons & Dragons. A specific example of this understanding was the Church of Ogma in the mid-12th century Dale Reckoning. And to those of you that have no idea what that statement means, I got you. Ogma was the primary god of knowledge, which included the preservation of tomes and teachings, basically the opposite of what happened when Rome fell. And the mid-12th century Dale Reckoning just refers to the calendar time in the Forgotten Realms. I want to stay focused on mimics though, so let's get back to what the church did. This church would raise and breed mimics that took the shape of books, and the church members would teach the mimics to envelop books, tomes, and the like to protect them from moisture and flame. The mimics actually took to the process rather well, provided they were fed regularly. And if they got a little hungrier than normal, they would essentially charge a little toll for reading the book in blood, which would keep them happy. This would not be a technique you could just use with any mimic, but if you remember back to when we first started this video, I mentioned there were two types of mimics, more and less intelligent than one another. It was common to distinguish these two mimics by their sizes. The larger mimics usually were less intelligent, while smaller mimics showed more understanding and capability of reason. That said, mimics were still opportunistic, so I'm sure a few Ogma clerics went missing every once and a while. So I want to talk briefly about mimic society. There isn't really one. Mimics were predominantly solitary creatures that often worked on their own. While there were exceptions to this, they were few and far between. That said, this wouldn't give you a full understanding if I didn't explore at least one of these exceptions. Introduced in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, Jeremy Crawford discussed the concept of formulated mimic colonies. These colonies developed a limited form of telepathy with one another that would work with their own kind along with other mimics that might have joined such colonies. I personally enjoy the idea of mimic colonies because it creates situations where player characters might walk into a room and anything could be a mimic, not to mention using their limited telepathy to communicate throughout a dungeon to potentially lead adventurers or really confuse their map maker by making false walls and new doors. But of course, such situations are few and far between. How could it possibly happen to you and your party members that you stumble upon such a situation? While we have talked about the primary two types of mimics, the large unintelligent ones and the smaller, smarter mimics, that does not mean there isn't an unending list of mimic variants, both from Dungeons & Dragons and from so many other IPs. But for the sake of keeping on track of the mimic-specific lore to D&D, I'll go over a handful of variants from Dungeons & Dragons that are somewhat unique and fun, so let's begin with that. And if you want to tell me about one of the variant mimics from one of those other IPs, feel free to do so. I would love to hear about it in the comments. So, frost mimics were a variant mysteriously created by dwarves in the Forgotten Realms. This was introduced in Dungeons & Dragons Neverwinter, so it's our first D&D video game reference here. It's rather unique as they were not monsters but trained creatures that served the dwarves. 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons divided the traditional mimic into 3 creatures: the object mimic, impersonator mimic, and the mimic spawn. Object mimics resembled actual mimics, so we don't need to cover them, and mimic spawn were the equivalent of baby mimics. I'd like to picture these small fries as mimics just after they split to reproduce, which is roughly how they function. Mimic spawn are simply a byproduct of the mimic impersonator though. Mimic impersonators are basically mimics that can impersonate creatures they devour. So if the mimic impersonator kills a guard, it would take the form of the guard and look for its next meal. When the impersonator consumes enough, it will divide, creating an object mimic, and any excess of the division will be mimic spawn. Obviously, this is a rather obscure version of the mimic throughout D&D overall, so let's move on. We're going to cover the peak of creativity as we look to Spelljammer for our next variant of mimic. the space mimic. Yes, you did hear it right. The creature is a unique form of mimic that exists in Spelljammer universe. What separated them from regular mimics was their natural pigmentation was that of twinkling cosmos. They were known to take the form of small abandoned spaceships or even space debris, and their most notable feature was their ability to perform magic, which made them particularly hungry for wayward wizards. Killer mimics were a variant, stronger form of the mimic introduced early in the editions. They're really just a stronger, bigger mimic. Our next variant is the House Hunter Mimic, which was a variant mimic introduced in AD&D appearing in Dungeon Magazine 19's The Vanishing Village. These are very rare, large variants of the mimic that biologically functioned a little differently, having armor plates it controlled similar to that of like a clam. They had tentacles as well as a long tongue that they would use to constrict creatures until they stopped breathing. They had the capability to generate small noises and light sources to attract creatures to them. So our next variant is the Metal Mimic. These were stronger variants of the normal mimic appearing in Dragon Magazine 101. These mimics were better at replicating metal, and they had the capability to use the light spell. They would use a section of their pseudopod and shape it to look like a sword or magic weapon, making it look like a glowing magical item. In addition to that feature, they would cast the Nistul's magical aura spell, allowing the item to actually appear as a magical item when it was divined. Similar to normal mimics as well, this mimic had a normal and killer variant as well. And to give some special acknowledgement, I did pull a lot of other mimic variants as well. There's so many more that we can cover, but these ones are a little further out there or just had less information overall. Some of them are just a little too obscure to be considered a mimic, but still fall into the right range, and some of them just did not have a whole lot of information or are very simple. So you've got the Fiendish Mimic, which came from the Manual of the Plains 2001, you have the Ghoul Mimic, which came from Sinister Spire in 2007, the Swamp Mimic, which came from Dungeon Magazine 41, the Mimic Grub, which came from Volo's Guide to Waterdeep in 1992, you have the Bowler, which is from the Monster Manual 2 in first edition in 1983. As a quick side to the Bowler, this is one of my favorite ones because it is just a giant boulder is what it looks like. So the art here on the screen will show you what it is. And I love this thing. I probably should look more into it. The Juggernaut, which came from T1 to T4 in the Temple of Elemental Evil. You have the Spanner, which came from the Monstrous Compendium Fiend Folio Appendix in 1992. The Polymar, which came from the Monstrous Compendium Mystara Appendix 1994, and the Marble Pudding, which came from the Dragon Magazine 251 in 1998. Now, not all of these are necessarily definitive, like, mimic variants. They are more so functioning similar to that of the mimic. For example, the Marble Pudding could make itself kind of look like a marble floor, and that's why it's kind of variant and could be kind of like a mimic. Alright, so now that we have the extensive list of some variants, let's cover one of the last topics before our 2024 comparison, and that is just facts I got along the way. So fun fact number one is mimics were actually known to be quite useful for recipes. Their skin was good for polymorph potions, their blood was used for spellcraft, their ichor was used for very rare spells as well, their glue and solvent sacs were used in alchemy, and several organs were used in production of perfume or foods. A rare poison, Heart of the Mimic Powder, was made with their nerve bundles and turned creatures to ooze. Just oozify someone. Fact number 2 for you. A magic item known as Joides Mask was only able to be destroyed by a mimic eating it. And fact number 3, when you refer to a group of mimics, it is an imitation. Alright, let's move to the list bit where we take a look at the art of the 2024 5e D&D mimic and read its description and do a little comparison and see if anything has changed in the recent editions. This is also a time for me to give some feedback on the changes to the creature as well, so let's begin with the description. In their natural forms, mimics are little more than roaming stomachs, their blobby bodies covered with alien eyes and teeth. They can alter their color, texture, and dimensions to duplicate inanimate objects of their approximate size. Mimics can use their disguises as both camouflage and bait. Once victims draw close, mimics strike, lashing out with their sticky pseudopods and toothy mouths. After consuming victims, mimics usually relocate, change forms, and await for their next meal. Use the following list to inspire mimic shape. I'm not going to read this list, I'll just provide it on the screen for you guys to read and just see some of the options that they provide. So just take a look at that here. Before I go over my thoughts on this description, let's take a moment to appreciate this comical art piece done. While we know that mimics are rarely seen working together, we did learn that they rarely work in small networks. This is precisely that situation. I think it is beautifully illustrated, showing unique ways the mimic could be represented. So our description was pretty straightforward. The mimic was described as having naturally blobby bodies, which isn't incorrect. They're also described to have alien eyes and teeth, which wasn't necessarily true, but has matched the depiction they have shown. I think it is oddly important here to clarify that mimics have some form of teeth, because oddly they have been depicted in a lot of parts in the past, but many of the descriptions oddly didn't go that much into detail specifically on their teeth. In either case, this was a creature that by all means isn't that straightforward, but they made it sound fun and very compelling to use. Now, just a complete side thought regarding the mimics in general. When they've been depicted in this most recent book, they are shown as having eyes that you can clearly see, which we know isn't correct, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's incorrect because the canonicity of this can change over time. I think I like the buildup that we've had for the ecology of mimics, and I think this art is just a fun way to show it as well. So I won't say this is like a bad depiction of mimics or a exceptionally great one either. I think it really teaches somebody what a mimic is though, so that's great. And that's mimics. The reason adventurers now carry 10-foot poles, have trust issues, and an irrational fear of furniture shopping. Seriously, I can't even walk into a tavern without glaring at every bar stool. Remember, if it looks too good to be true, it's probably a toothy death trap. Thanks for watching, and may all of the treasure chests stay stationary, not slimy, and preferably not trying to eat you. My name's Jimmy, the local game master. See you in the next one.